So, Darwin, as an old man, he wrote this book on the origin of species. He came up with the idea, and then we'll go through it and we'll see. So, initially, obviously, before Darwin came along, people thought about the natural world and they categorize things. We all categorize things all the time. And then other peoples have different creation and, stories and diversity stories and all that. The Hopi, there was a big flood, they all went underground. With the Ant people, they came back up. After the flood, everything was good. But we'll start with the Greeks. And so Plato had this idea of the allegory of the cave. Anybody know what the allegory of the cave is? Okay. So there was, in Plato's day, there were lots of different gods. There was Zeus and Apollo, all these different gods. The gods were pretty much kind of like people. They had personalities and all that. And in the world where the gods were, that's the perfection of the world or of the universe. And everything down here is like we went into a cave and you get a fire with shadows on the wall, and this is basically down here, what we are, is shadows on a wall. It's kind of shadows of an imperfect ethos, but up with the gods is perfect. And that everything up with the gods was made perfectly, optimally, and never changed. Then Aristotle came along, and let's see, he put the great chain of being. So, the ladder of intellect. First you have stone. Oops, hold on a second. Stone, then flame, then plant, then beast, then human, heaven, angel, right? Finally, God. And then, of course, the very, very top is Professor Beck. Right? So this is a great chain of being in this class. You're down at humans and I'm up at the very top. It's the way it is. I can't help it. It is what it is, right? And then, as far as Judeo-Christian thinking, they were still doing typological thinking, like each creature was made perfect by God and had adaptations, these amazing things, so birds could fly and all that, because of God's benevolence. And this view of the universe was static. It didn't change ever. And at about the 18th century, this guy named Carolus Linnaeus started classifying things. So he put the plants together based on what they look like and put the fungi together and closer to plants, and then there were animals and all that kind of stuff. So he classified things. He didn't think anything changed, but around that time, people were starting to find fossils, and it was kind of strange. If God was benevolent to all his creation, and he had all these perfect adaptations, then why were things in the past alive and not alive today, in terms of whole species? And of course, at this time, remember, the world is only about 6,500 years old. So finally, in the 18th century, let's see, I guess it was, or actually the 19th century, late 18th century, people started realizing, well, there were fossils, and there was this guy, Georges Cuvier, in Paris, and the whole Paris basin is full of all these fossils that are found in the ocean, shells and all that kind of stuff. And he actually was an atheist, or a deist, not a theist. And he surmised that there was at one point a great catastrophic flood or something like that, but not out of the Bible, and it deposited all these things up here. And it showed that, in fact, the world actually could change, that things were not completely static. And they could change quickly, like with catastrophic effect. And then there was this guy Lamarck, who kind of articulated the first theory of evolution, which was that individual creatures, say animals, if they use certain things over and over again, like let's say I go to the gym, I start pumping iron, get really big. I have lots of kids, and they all come out like this, really big. They've inherited my muscles, right? In other words, this idea of use. So inheritance of acquired characteristics that you acquire during your life. The giraffes are a good example. The ones that can reach taller have offspring that can reach taller, and eventually you end up with a tall giraffe. Okay. And then a guy named Charles Lyell, who was kind of a mentor to Darwin, was a geologist, and he kind of showed that the same processes in terms of geology were still going on today that were going on in the past, and that in fact the world was a lot older than people had surmised. And so he had this idea of uniformitarianism, where the same processes are going on now that went on in the past, and versus catastrophism, where you had these catastrophic events. Of course, it turns out that they're both right. There have been catastrophic events in the past when, like, an asteroid hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. But the same processes that are going on now went on in the past with volcanism but he didn't necessarily think that he thought that species might change depending on their environment, but they were still independently created. So this is a modern Lamarckian evolution. Remember acquired characteristics. So Joan Rivers, right? Lots of plastic surgeries, and eventually she had a daughter who came out looking like she did. You're not laughing. Okay, doesn't matter. Okay. That's not how evolution works. So along comes Darwin first and then Wallace, and Darwin takes a little trip around the world in the Beagle, and he's a naturalist on board. 1831 to 1836, took him a while to get back. No steam power or anything like that. He went to the Galapagos, discovered Darwin's finches. He didn't come up with the theory of evolution by natural selection then. Started thinking about it. About 20 years later, now Darwin was highborn. In other words, he was a man of leisure. Whereas this guy Wallace was a working class fellow who made his living by going around the world and collecting for wealthy patrons. Okay, so there's the beach. This is the trip that he took. And then Alfred Russel Wallace first went to South America and then down to Southeast Indonesia and that area. In fact, if you go down to Indonesia now, you can see here's Borneo, Sulawesi, the Philippines up here, right? And what he found, there's this thing called the Wallace Line that seems to be a zone that separates one group of organisms, plants and animals, and then another. And on the one side, you have stuff that is similar to Southeast Asia. And then on the other, you have all this other stuff, like in Australia and New Guinea, wallabies, lots of marsupials, all kinds of stuff that you don't find. And the Wallace Line is a big trench, and it's these two different areas of different faunas. Okay, now, and he was the father of biogeography, of why do you find certain animals, let's say, in a certain place and not others. Now, of course, with Lyell, he would have said, well, you find organisms that are adapted to the desert and deserts, irrespective of where the deserts are, or rainforests, or whatever, right? Different habitats, different environments. But Wallace and Darwin showed that that's, in fact, not the case. That you have faunas and floras, like plants and animals, that they may look different, but they're all related to each other from descent from a common ancestor. So here's the kind of evidence of explanations for biological diversity. And this is pretty much separate creation. So God created all these taxa, these perfectly created animals and plants, and they didn't change through time. So this is all time, right? And then Lamarck, kind of this independently created, but they did change through time. And then here we have what's called a cladogram, where we see everything is related by descent from a common ancestor. Okay, so here's a common ancestor for this taxa. Here's a common ancestor. Here's a common ancestor for the whole shebang. Okay. So, what is evolution? I could have asked you first, but it's all about sex and death. We'll finish on this slide. That's all it is. You want to have as much of the former sex before the latter comes along. So you want to put off death as long as you can and have as much sex as possible. And you want to leave lots of offspring. So by the end of this semester, I want to make sure that there's some pregnant people in here. I want you to look around and think, he looks cute. She looks cute. Start getting with it, okay? That's really the whole bit about evolution. It's all about sex and death. It's actually about reproduction But what you want to do is you want to live long enough to reproduce. Occasionally people try to mix the two. I wouldn't do it. Mixing sex and death. It's also kind of funny that religion from the Middle East, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they're pretty much concerned about the same thing that evolutionary biologists are, sex and death. They're worried about dying, and so they don't want to die, and they'll live happily ever after. And if you read the Bible, you'll realize they're obsessed with sex. Who begot who, and they have a kind of strange view of women. But anyway, religious people live it, I just study it, okay? But that's really what evolution is about. How things change over time, and that individuals who have traits like those periwinkles with 6 shells leave more offspring and leave more of their genes into future generations. And individuals who don't reproduce don't leave their genes into future generations. That's why I want you all guys to have as much sex as possible. As for me, I'm one of the walking dead. I don't have any kids, and thank God. Okay? But you have them. Do as I say, not as I do. Okay, so we'll meet again. It's only one day a week. It's a long time between Fridays. I miss you guys, just so you know. So I'll see you next week. On Moodle, I've posted things like readings and all that. You can look at that stuff. Mm-hmm.